theological education primarily is not historically and in the present designed for the apostolic, for the missionaries. I mean, it's designed for a pastoral approach. And so if, again, heavily coming out of European context, if we're looking at how do I maintain a flock, then things that are going to be related to the unreached people groups living in the Himalayas, that's the farthest thing from the radar screen of necessity as possible, because I'm more concerned about my flock and my community as a pastoral caregiver.
The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize the people of God to be a part of His mission.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison, and our frequent listeners and viewers know what I'm going to say right now. Ted, my good friend and co-host, welcome. Good to see you.
How are you doing today, Matthew?
Yeah, I'm doing really well, brother. I am thrilled to have J.D. Payne with us. J.D. is a longtime friend of both Ted and I. And brother, thanks for being here today.
Man, it's a delight. I did not know that you guys had all these recordings. If I had known that, I would have come up with a much, I would make this time more difficult for you. I can't adjust that quickly on the fly.
That's why we didn't tell you.
Yeah, that's right. JD, tell folks what you're up to these days.
Man, I just hang out and do podcasts all day long with anybody that invites me on their show. And I'm just kidding. So I'm the professor of Christian ministry at Samford University in Birmingham, Alabama. I've been in this role for the past 6 years, and have been living in Birmingham for about 12. Lord willing, this summer will be 12 years. I've spent about 26 years in the classroom at the seminary level, the undergraduate level, 19 years in pastoral ministry and pastoring churches and working with church planting teams in Indiana and Kentucky and also in Alabama. And I've known you guys for several years, and just an honor and delight to be with you two.
Yeah.
Let me preface our talk with, we both love theological education. And we're going to be asking some questions about that today. But I think it's really important just to stay right up front how much I appreciate what you do. And we're not doing it these days in an environment that's particularly easy. So with that said, as kind of a beginning, Matthew, I'm going to hand the baton back over to you.
Yeah.
I thought we were going to talk about coffee today. I didn't know we were going to talk about theology. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I just want to underscore what he said. Totally value theological education. We're going to press today on some things, but we see its value, and we're grateful for folks that serve in your space, JD. So here's how I want to frame the podcast today. JD, Ted knows, we commissioned a Barna research study with pioneers last year. And the purpose of the study was to better understand the pastor's view and perception of missions. And they used their proprietary audience of 426 U.S. Protestant pastors. And the findings will be published this fall. We'll be doing several thought leader briefings. JD, you got to be a part of some of those. Ted, you as well. I think Missio is going to host a couple of those, where we want to share the findings with the larger Great Commission community. As we've seen in other data, pastors are recently turning their focus more and more towards domestic and local issues and concerns rather than broader international ministry. Listen to this. A mere 25% of them said they were passionate about cross-cultural missions, so just a quarter. In fact, international and local cross-cultural missions garnered the strongest responses of not passionate or not at all passionate among pastors. I'm not going to give all the granular stuff right now because the study's not published, but that's kind of the general overview. Now, here's where it gets interesting, JD. Of the pastors surveyed, those with seminary or divinity school degrees are significantly more likely to report passion towards those in their community and little passion towards those towards cross-cultural work or missions. So our first question is, does any of this surprise you?
It does not, and I think there are multiple streams of why that is the case. First of all, just a footnote, I'm very excited about your study and really looking forward to it when it comes out. I think there are multiple streams as far as why this is the case. I mean, one thing I think we have to factor in is, and I know this is like a redundancy that everyone keeps saying, and that is we're now in that post-COVID period. So I recognize, I think that's a factor, and you've got all these things going on related to pastoral burnout, and it's just a really difficult time right now for church leaders, and I can see how they want to conserve and maintain and turn inwardly, which I think typically has been the heart of a pastor. If a pastor is a shepherd, to shepherd the flock, care for the flock. I think the other stream that's there is that we still haven't seen any. Some schools are different, but for the most part, we have not seen any sizable shifts in theological education related to the nations, like what we've been talking about in the missions community and have desired for decades. So I think those are two big streams that are happening. I think, just the changing dynamics in congregations that are declining. There are different factors that are there. So I'm not surprised.
Well, I mean, I would just want to ask you, sitting where you're sitting, how much access do you get to students at your school? I mean, how core is missions education to the degrees you offer? Those are all questions that just boil right to the top of my head.
Right. Our program is different. Our department is only 6 years old. So when Dr. Scott Guffin 7 years ago outlined this program for the Christian Ministry Department at Samford, the first hire that they brought into the department was me to teach missions and evangelism. So he sculpted our program with disciple making at the core. So everything that we're doing is focused on disciple making. So there is a very heavy dose of missions related matters. We refer to it as intercultural engagement. That applies whether you're going to be serving a local church here in the States, or whether you're going to be maybe on an apostolic team in another part of the world, or maybe even in a North American context. Our students they're saturated with this element of the Great Commission. But I will say, to be fair, I think we're atypical because we're an undergraduate program. To be fair, I think we're atypical than most that's out there.
I know I've talked to many pastors who take the Perspectives course long after seminary, long after they've been in the pastorate for years, and they say, "Why didn't I hear this teaching at seminary?" I've heard it repeatedly. Any reason, any thought as to why that's the case? How can JD? You talk about missions being the plot line of the scriptures. I've heard you say it before. And there's that old adage, every time a pastor preaches a message, make a beeline to the cross, and you say, yes, but also make a beeline to the plot line. How does this teaching have a place in God's larger picture? So if missions is the plot line of scripture, this redemptive story, how is it possible that seminaries marginalize it and it's not a part of the core curriculum?
That I think goes all the way back. The modern theological educational system will go all the way back to Schleiermacher's influence, and the category of what was referred to as theological education, known as that more practical component, pastoral theology, that was different from your Bible and your history and your theology. It still didn't press in on the mission aspect, on evangelism and missions. So you have theological education across the Western world that builds out of this German model, and we've thoroughly embraced it within a North American context as well. Back in 1988, Donald McGavran, when he was still alive, his last publication was a book called Effective Evangelism, A Theological Mandate. When he wrote that book, now he had just, in 1965, he becomes the dean of the School of World Mission at Fuller. So in 1988, he's reflecting on what's going on across theological education. And in 88, he writes this last book, and he lays out part of the reason, to answer your question, Matthew, is because theological educators have very little aspects of theological education related to evangelism and missions. And so he begins to lay out a case for 5 required classes that all master level students should take. When you look at McGavran's time in the 80s and even today, decades later, you're hard pressed to find institutions that require, not as an elective, but require more than a 3-hour evangelism course and or 6 hours an evangelism course and an intro to missions class. You're hard pressed if you can find something more than 3 to 6 hours. Again, there's some schools out there that are doing some excellent work in shifting that. But as far as universally across institutions, we're still in that era of concern that McGavran had way back in the 80s.
So Fuller is my alma mater. I went to Fuller, and I graduated from the School of Intercultural Studies. That's now been subsumed into the School of Theology. So there really isn't a School of Intercultural Studies like the one I went to. And that's not the only place where that's happening. I think, when I talk to schools like that, they will say, well, there's no students for these programs. Is that what you're finding too? Is it a demand issue or a supply issue?
Well, I have not thought about it on that level before. I think part of it is a continuation of what we've been doing, and you will get what you set out as leaders to do. In other words, if this is what we do as leaders, people are going to come to that, and they're going to assume you know best because you're the leaders. Theological education primarily is not historically and in the present designed for the apostolic, for the missionaries. I mean, it's designed for a pastoral approach. And so if, again, heavily coming out of European context, if we're looking at how do I maintain a flock, then things that are going to be related to the unreached people groups living in the Himalayas, that's the farthest thing from the radar screen of necessity as possible, because I'm more concerned about my flock and my community as a pastoral caregiver. And so, again, I think historically, theologically, we've dichotomized these elements of the mission of God. And so we've been very comfortable with training pastors, training local church leaders, primarily through seminary contexts, thinking that mission stuff is all about those who aren't going to be connected to local churches, and it's for a different category of church leader. So I think it's a combination, Ted. I think it's, as leaders, we set the trajectory, and that's who comes to us. And at the same time, we also have to say, well, there are schools that are out there that are doing some really good things in this area, and we're seeing students move in that direction for that missiological training.
I wonder if a reframing is not needed. There's a quote. I don't know who came up with it. I would give attribution if I could remember it. But missions is not only necessary for the life of the world. It is necessary, the health and life of the world. Mm-hmm. It's necessary for the health and the life of the church. And if we divorce missions from our discipleship paradigm, mm-hmm. and health, you talk about, pastors are focused on those immediate needs that are around them, and the furthest things from their mind is, unreached people groups in the Himalayas. But a church will never truly be vital and healthy until it's embraced the mission of God. Do you think a reframing is needed here?
I think it is. Now, I'm speaking, my calling is pastor teacher. I'm not the missionary type. I'm not the Apostle Paul type. So my calling direction, has been in that vein. The way that I've communicated it, Matthew, is I think pastors need to function as pastors. They don't need to operate outside of their calling. But here's the thing: in that whole Ephesians 4, 11, and 12 of equipping the saints, we have to think pastorally. Or excuse me, let me rephrase that. We have to act pastorally, but we have to learn to think apostolically. And if we can learn to think apostolically, then that's going to put everything in a different framework, to kind of use your language there, when it comes to equipping the people in my local congregation. That the apostolic imagination is an imagination that embraces not only the going to the nations, but also the caring for the church. And we've got to learn to think in that way as pastors. And I do not think that most institutions are training pastors to do that. I think that oftentimes we're still bifurcating. There's those that are going to be sent out with mission agencies, mission organizations, and then there are those that are going to be on staff with local congregations. And we want them all in our classes, but at the end of the day, we're not helping pastors, I think, to develop that apostolic imagination. I think the best that we're doing is a lot of, I hope you pick it up by osmosis. And we teach our missions classes, and I think there are some great professors out there doing some great things, but it's not really helping the pastors learn to think globally like that.
I mean, in my world, so I work with mission agencies, a lot of mission agencies, churches as well, but mostly mission agencies. They have developed alternate educational systems and structures for the most part. And I would say, if someone comes to me and asks about missions education, my first thought is not to send them to a seminary. It's, there's all these training programs, resident 1 to 2 year training programs where you go do church planning while learning church planning, do evangelism while learning it. They offer courses in that context. In one sense, that question of supply and demand, I actually think there's a lot of students out there for it, but they're not going to get it at a school. And so that's not even on the radar screen. They're going to these shorter practicums, which are great. I think they do a good job. Not to the same level of depth that you might get if you're studying in a more formal context. So I think that's been one response that's come from the missions community out there right now. I mean, I don't know if you see much of that, if you try to work much practical into what you're doing at the seminary level, but that's what I think mission students are looking for.
Yeah, I agree. But I think even our theology needs to bend toward the practical. So even when I teach like biblical theology, I always bend it toward the practical. So yes, I mean we have to move away from the educational experience of just being a cerebral approach. There's the place for the cognitive, of course, but there has to be that element of as the old adage, the head, the heart, and the hands. So I do see that growing out there, especially larger churches, mission agencies that are also doing in-house training. So those are out there. I think there are many things that are to be commended. I know that the traditional route is not what is best for everyone, and so yeah. I mean, I'm seeing that. I think that part of the appeal is the compressed time and the practicality that is there. But I would say, as you guys mentioned at the beginning, there is a place for the more formalized training, but I would also add to that, it needs to bend in the practical, regardless of what we're teaching. Even teaching something on history, I think we always need to be bending it toward the Great Commission.
I also wonder about the approach that we're taking to biblical education, especially with younger people, where I think they're more motivated to see the arc of the whole story and not the particularization. And I wonder if you see, again, in the seminary world, is the arc of redemptive history the focus? Because you would get missions if you did that, as opposed to, topical or systematic approaches to understanding the Bible.
I'm seeing it in certain areas of the evangelical community, and where it's happening has been with some of in the past 20 years or so, some of the conferences that have been occurring, various popular preachers on this topic, podcasts on this topic, things that have really caught on within the past couple of decades or so. So I agree. I think that you're right, Ted. I see students that are much more familiar with the Genesis through Revelation understanding of God's mission, and it's not as atomized as like when I was growing up. But here's the thing here's where I'm seeing kind of the breakdown. I'm seeing a lot of younger adults knowing that it's there, They understand that it's there, but then to press them on it and ask them to describe it, they have a hard time. And so I can say, give me some biblical support for the mission of God. And of course, they're going to jump to Matthew 28. They're going to jump to Acts 1:8. They may jump to Matthew, 24 or something like that. But then when you begin to say, well, what does First and Second Chronicles have to do with all this? And then you get kind of this deer in the headlight look. But they know something's there, and I think part of what has put it there, as opposed to this atomized approach that I had growing up, is that which has been in the evangelical world, particularly in the United States, in the past, I'd say 20 to 30 years.
I did a mission table with you, JD, a few years ago. Ted's been a guest on the mission table as well, but we talked about, pastors and missions. How do you crack the code of pastoral engagement? And I started off talking about that statement that you made. Every time you teach a message, make a beeline, yes, to the cross, but a beeline to the plot line. And I've really incorporated that because I do a lot of Bible teachings that aren't missions related. And I always ask myself, how does this fit into God's larger narrative? Sometimes it's totally obvious. Sometimes it's not. But how does this fit into this master story of redemption? One of the questions I have related to this, these theological institutions, given that they're Bible-based, that they view the scripture as the inspired word of God, hopefully that's the main textbook, right? How do we make it possible, JD, to go to a higher, Christian education institute? How do we make it impossible for a student to graduate and not understand that is the meta narrative of Ted, as Ted said? It is the master story. Whether or not they specialize in a missions department or get a degree in missions, what does it look like to integrate that type of teaching into an overall educational experience?
It's turning a battleship, Matthew. That's it's a very thick culture with centuries of tradition, and so it's not going to happen overnight. In fact, I think some institutions will never change, and that's just a reality we have to accept and understand. Some of the things that have brought me encouragement is not so much in the missions world, but in maybe the New Testament world of some theologians that are out there, N.T. Wright and others that are starting to and have been talking about, Kevin Van Hooser and others talking about the missional hermeneutic, that we need a missional hermeneutic this, missional hermeneutic that. And it's like, I totally expect that from the missions community. I totally expect that from, the David Hesselgraves. I expect Paul Heberts and others to, push in on these things. But wait a minute, N.T. Wright? Oh, what's going on here? And so I'm not expecting my theologian brothers and sisters and New Testament, Old Testament brothers and sisters to be giving a lot of street cred to Arthur Glasser. But when N.T. Wright speaks, maybe something different's going on. So there is something that has been happening in the past couple of decades outside of missiology as a discipline per se, that I think has brought some encouraging, fresh perspectives. But even at that level, it still has not caught on, and it still hasn't saturated, I think, a lot of the academy.
Do you use the language of missional, and do you think that is good language?
As long as I can define it and establish the context in which I'm speaking. So if I cannot, and I'm not familiar with the audience, I will oftentimes kind of shy away from that. Sometimes I'll use it and then I'll quickly define it and then move on. So it just depends on the audience to whom I'm having a conversation, whether it's one person or a classroom.
I do get different reactions from within the missions community about the use of that word. Well, some people feel like, it's a co-option of real mission, trying to turn everything into the local church ministry. That'd be kind of one side of it. The other side of it is hey, here's a connecting point. Here's we can draw a line between, our segregated island of missions here and everybody else. But I do wonder if, the whole diaspora push, which is localized and cross-cultural, there seems to be so many potential attachment points for us to be doing a better job in local churches than we're doing now. Anybody, so you mentioned a couple of theologians there. other sources where you're seeing people really, like you were just at EMS, I believe, right?
At our regional meeting, yes.
Regional meeting. Mm-hmm. Anybody talking about this there?
Not necessarily in that language of missional. I mean, again, I don't want to beat my own drum, but I've sort of moved a little away from that, and I've started using the word apostolic, the adjective.
Yeah.
And part of it is to cause people to sit up and say, "What? What's he talking about?" And then to say, "Wait a minute, define that, because I'm not certain what you mean." If I say the word missional, they've already got some baggage, because, if we go back into 1998, when Daryl Guter, publishes Missional Church in the United States, we got, several years of history there where that word and definition has run in a multitude of different directions. So I'm starting to use, and have been using, the word apostolic, because I think it gets really at the heart of the matter of the sent nature of God's people into the world, and the fact that He's an apostolic God. But as far as the language of mission, the language of missional, it'll pop up every now and then, but oftentimes it's popped up without any sort of definition. You almost have to hang out for the context for a few minutes before you figure out, oh, that's what that person's talking about. But I'm sure there's some people that are still using it quite regularly.
So you're not getting into any trouble there at the seminary with your systematic theologian friends when you use the word apostolic, huh?
Well, my car tires were slashed last week in the parking lot. No, nothing. No real. Probably being ignored. That's usually what happens with me. Everyone ignores me. So, and then in 10 or 15 years, they'll come up with an idea, and it's like, yeah, 10 years ago.
We're laughing here, but when I co-wrote "When Everything Is Missions" with Denny Spitters in 2017, we didn't fully appreciate that we were going to stir up some trouble. I mean, we knew it was a long-held belief. Everyone's a missionary. We'd heard it for a long time. In fact, JD, you contributed a chapter to book 2.
That's why it never sold.
On "When Everything Is Missions." And you talked about how we got here. How did we arrive at a place where we started calling everyone a missionary and everything missions? But I didn't fully appreciate that we were going to pick a fight. And part of the reason we've picked a fight with this, challenge to clarify terminology, make sure your missions ideas and definitions are not shaped by trends or what matters to you or personal interest, but by the Bible. The reason we ruffled feathers is because they've been telling their congregations for so long that they're all missionaries. And, you're going into the missions field and everyone's a missionary. Well-intentioned ideas, by the way, let me just say that. Well-intentioned ideas, but they have unintended consequences. Even the whole missional movement we're talking about, there's so much I love about it. It was, you mentioned the late 90s, it was challenging the church to get out of the building and to engage in the culture, to be salt and light. I love that. Mm-hmm. But what came with it was everyone's a missionary, and also the obscuring of the priority of taking the gospel to every nation, every tribe, and every tongue. But, as we're laughing about tires being slashed, you challenge some of these ideas that we've been saying for a long time. And man, it bothers people.
It does. And I never try to pick a fight, and I don't think you guys were trying to do that either. The Lord requires us to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, with Him. And so no, but to speak, convictionally or speak with conviction on some of these issues that you really strongly believe in, there will be pushback because you're challenging longstanding traditions and a very thick culture in what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I'm not surprised that you've experienced that, and others will experience it in days to come. Anytime we try something new, I mean, we evangelicals are very conservative, not just theologically, but we're very conservative methodologically and strategically. Yeah. And so when you touch that which is sacred, strategy and method, the way that we've done things before, that we've equated with something being sacred, it's almost like you're attacking that which you should not touch, the old sacred cow kind of.
Yeah. Well, the Barna study reveals, it'll come out, as I mentioned, this fall, but the vast majority of pastors believe everything is missions of the survey group, which again, a relatively accurate picture of the United States, according to Barna's, statistical data. And a lot of them are seminary trained. So I got to think that message is coming out in seminaries.
Well, I think there are two things. One issue is that, yes, I think that's true. But two, there's just a culture out there. I mean, that'll preach, man. I mean, I get up and I can get up and say, "You're all missionaries. You're all missionaries." I mean, that'll preach. What was it, Spurgeon? You're an imposter or you're a missionary.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's going to get an amen corner going. So there is there's that cultural drive to motivate that I think is very, very important.
Yes.
But the means of motivation I don't think that's a healthy means by which we motivate. So I think it's twofold. I think it does come from the academy, but I think it also comes from just a very thick tradition of, well, I'm supposed to be sharing the gospel. You all need to be sharing the gospel. You all need to be missionaries in your schools and at home and on the other side of the world.
Your comment earlier about methodology is very true. And when I did the book on innovation, I had people saying to me, "Wait a second," and they were questioning innovation as a concept. And I said, "Well, we have lots of room and freedom to innovate and do things in ministry. Of course, innovation is a topic. Jesus was innovative."
Yes.
But that methodological pull is really strong, especially in missions. Mm-hmm. And the little phrase I like to give is, when your methodology becomes your theology, your ecclesiology becomes a pathology. Yeah. It's so easy for us to substitute in that methodology for, what really shouldn't be something that's sacred, but it's hard.
Right. Yeah, I mean, even looking at just mission history, I mean, there was a time we only hung out on the coastlines, but then someone said, "Hey, we need to go to the interiors." Mm-hmm. It's like, no, you don't go to the interiors. You got to stay within the gunships. Let's do a China inland mission. Let's do an African inland mission. So, yeah, you're right, Ted. I mean, we have a history, and I think it does go back to the New Testament time of innovation, but it's not like innovating, trying to come up with the next iPhone and get it to market before my competitor. It's moving into the world. I was telling my students this before jumping on here. It's like moving into the world as a spirit-filled community, followers of Christ, into a world filled with all these pressures. And as the Spirit guides us, we have to make adjustments to what we do and how we do it.
Amen. Any, it's okay if they're not, but any highlights from EMS that stuck out to you from your regional meeting?
This whole year, the theme is on frontiers in mission, which is kind of along this our conversation right now. Some really good presentations. I heard a presentation on innovation, on developing an imagination for innovation. Presentation on the frontier of what about all of the Muslims that are moving away from Islam? How do we minister to them? So a lot of diverse presentations. I think I heard about 30 papers presented on Saturday, and on a variety of different topics related to frontiers in mission today. And so some good stuff out there.
Great. Sounds good.
Well, brother, pleasure having you. Always love the conversation. You mentioned apostolic imagination. You've written a book by this title. How do people pick that up?
Well, they just bend over and grab it with their hands and lift it up. That's how they pick it up. Oh, sorry. It's been a long day. I've been going since 4:30. So you got to have a little podcast humor in here. See, if you're always focused on the cerebral, the academic, then, it's no fun. Wherever you buy your books, you can find it anywhere. Barnes & Noble, Amazon. It's probably in used bookstores by now. Students have bought it and said, "I don't want this trash."
Yeah, it's probably true. They go there fast these days. I've learned that. People come on up to me and say, "Look what I got at Goodwill." So thanks for letting me know that. Well, thank you very much. It was a great conversation. Appreciate you and your time.
Yes, sir. Thank you, guys.
Before you go, Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. The Mission Matters podcast is a partnership of 1615 and Missio Nexus. Check out 1615.org and missionexus.org for more resources on the mission of God and the matters of the mission. The Mission Matters podcast is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Essler, president of Missio Nexus.